The night is quiet, the world asleep. So pour yourself some coffee, settle in, and let the mystery begin. You're watching Sherlock Tales. Subscribe now and step deeper into the shadows with every story. The autumn of 1895 had settled upon London with a peculiar malevolence, wrapping the great metropolis in a shroud of persistent fog that seemed to muffle not merely sound, but the very essence of rational thought itself. It was during this season of perpetual twilight that there came to our lodgings at 221B Baker Street a case so singular in its impossibility, so steeped in the macabre theatricality of death, that even now, years hence, I find my hand trembling slightly as I set pen to paper to record these extraordinary events. The gas lamps in our sitting room flickered with an unsteady light that November evening, casting dancing shadows across the familiar furnishings that had witnessed so many of Holmes's triumphs over the seemingly inexplicable. My friend sat in his accustomed chair, his lean frame folded into that characteristic pose of deep contemplation, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his keen grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point in the middle distance. The blue smoke from his pipe wreathed about his aquiline features, lending him an almost ethereal appearance, as though he were a figure conjured from the very mists that pressed against our windows. I'd been attempting to chronicle one of our recent adventures when the silence of our domestic tranquility was shattered by a sound that sent an involuntary chill through my frame. Not the measured knock of a client seeking consultation, nor the official rap of a constable bearing summons, but a series of urgent, almost frantic blows upon our door that spoke of desperation bordering upon panic. Holmes, without stirring from his reverie, merely raised an eyebrow in my direction, a silent command I'd learned to interpret through long association. Upon opening the door, I was confronted by a sight that banished all thoughts of the evening's quiet pursuits. Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard stood upon our threshold, his usually immaculate appearance dishevelled, his ruddy complexion pale as parchment, and his eyes, those eyes that had gazed unflinchingly upon the worst that London's criminal element could devise, now held a bewildered, almost fearful glint that I had never before witnessed in that stalwart officer of the law. "Holmes! Watson!" he burst forth, his voice hoarse with urgency and stripped of its customary gruffness. "Thank heaven you are both in. I fear I am confronted with something that transcends the boundaries of ordinary criminal investigation. Something that challenges the very foundations of rational thought itself." Rainwater streamed from the brim of his bowler hat, forming dark pools upon our Persian carpet, a transgression to which he remained utterly oblivious. His hands trembled as he removed his gloves, and I observed that his usually steady demeanour had been replaced by an agitation so profound that it bordered upon the theatrical. Holmes, at last stirring from his contemplative pose, regarded the inspector with that peculiar mixture of amusement and professional interest that invariably preceded his involvement in a case of unusual complexity. "My dear Lestrade," said he, his voice maintaining its characteristic calm, "you present the appearance of a man who has wrestled with forces beyond his comprehension. Pray take a seat and compose yourself. The fog carries with it the scent of camphor and formaldehyde. You have been to a place where the dead are preserved for the edification of the living. A museum, perhaps, or a mortuary of unusual character." Lestrade sank into the chair opposite Holmes, his eyes widening at this display of deductive reasoning. "Good Lord, Holmes, how could you possibly— But no, there is no time for amazement at your methods. You are quite correct. I've come directly from the Barlow Institute of Artistic Modelling in Bloomsbury, though London knows it better as the Whispering Wax Museum, for the peculiar acoustic properties of its galleries and the unsettling manner in which the figures seem to lean from their alcoves as though imparting secrets to the visitors. Holmes leaned forward, his attention now fully engaged. "And what impossibility has this temple of silent effigies presented to confound the collective wisdom of Scotland Yard?" "Murder, Holmes, or something that defies that very definition," Lestrade replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Mr. Elias Thorne, the proprietor of the establishment, was discovered this morning by his assistant in circumstances so bizarre, so utterly inexplicable that my men are beginning to whisper of supernatural intervention. The facts, Lestrade, Holmes interjected with characteristic precision. Spare me the interpretations and present me with the observable phenomena. Lestrade drew a shuddering breath and began his extraordinary recitation. Thorne was found in the Chamber of Horrors, that ghastly exhibition featuring wax representations of history's most notorious criminals. He was discovered seated in a chair directly before the figure of Professor Moriarty, his face frozen in an expression of such absolute terror that even our most experienced constables were visibly shaken by the sight. At the mention of his late nemesis, Holmes's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, though his voice remained steady. Continue. The chamber was locked from within, Holmes. Every window, every skylight, every conceivable point of entry was secured. The night watchman, old Timothy Morse, a reliable man who had served in Her Majesty's army, swore that no one had entered or departed the building during his watch. Yet there sat Thorne, dead as a doornail, with not a mark upon his person to indicate violence. The cause of death? Holmes inquired. Heart failure, according to Dr. Abernathy, the police surgeon. But here is where the matter transcends ordinary medical explanation. Thorne was a man of robust constitution, barely 50 years of age, with no history of cardiac ailment. Moreover, there were peculiarities about the scene that defy rational explanation. Holmes rose and moved to the fireplace, taking up his tobacco pouch with deliberate movements. Peculiarities, you say? Pray elaborate. His eyes, Holmes, they were wide open, staring directly at the Moriarty figure, and filled with such terror as I have never witnessed in all my years of police work. His mouth was agape, as though he had been attempting to cry out, but found himself unable to produce sound. And then there was the wax. The wax? I interjected, unable to contain my curiosity. Yes, Watson, a thin film of wax, almost invisible to the naked eye, had been applied to his eyelids and lips. Not roughly, mind you, but with an almost artistic delicacy, as though someone had attempted to seal his eyes and mouth with the very substance of his trade. Dr. Abernathy insists it was insufficient to cause death. Yet there it was, a macabre signature left by some unknown hand. Holmes had begun to pace before the hearth, his pipe forgotten in his hand, his mind already engaged with the puzzle presented. You mentioned witnesses, the night watchman and others. Indeed, old Morse heard what he described as whispers emanating from the Chamber of Horrors at approximately midnight. When he investigated, he found nothing amiss, though he later swore that the Moriarty figure seemed to have shifted slightly in its chair. Miss Vivian Ashford, Thorne's assistant curator, reported that several of the wax figures had been mysteriously repositioned during the night. Napoleon moved before a mirror, Lady Macbeth with her hands at her throat. These figures weigh several hundredweight each, Holmes, and are mounted upon heavy pedestals. And yet, Holmes mused, no sign of forced entry, no evidence of struggle, no weapon, no clear motive. Tell me, Lestrade, who possessed keys to the establishment? Only Thorne himself and Miss Ashford. The building is secured each evening with multiple locks, and the night watchman patrols the interior but cannot exit without setting off an alarm system of Thorne's own devising. It is, by all accounts, impregnable. Holmes ceased his pacing and fixed Lestrade with that penetrating stare that had unnerved countless criminals. You have, I presume, questioned all parties with access to the premises? Thoroughly. Miss Ashford appears genuinely distraught. She had worked with Thorne for nearly 2 years and speaks of him with evident respect and affection. The night watchman is a simple, honest fellow whose military record is exemplary. The daytime staff had no access to the building after hours. We are, quite simply, baffled. A long silence settled upon our sitting room, broken only by the steady tick of the mantelpiece clock and the distant rumble of hansom cabs navigating the fog-shrouded streets. Holmes stood motionless before the fire, his keen mind undoubtedly sifting through the extraordinary details Lestrade had presented, searching for that thread of logic that would unravel the seemingly impossible tangle. Finally, he turned to face us, and I observed that familiar transformation that occurred when a case worthy of his extraordinary abilities presented itself. The languor vanished from his features, replaced by an intensity of purpose that seemed to charge the very air around him. "My dear Lestrade," said he, "you have presented me with a most intriguing puzzle. A man dies of apparent fright in a locked chamber, surrounded by silent witnesses of wax, with mysterious voices heard in the night and figures that move of their own accord. While I do not subscribe to supernatural explanations for earthly phenomena, I'm compelled to admit that the circumstances you describe possess elements that challenge conventional reasoning." He moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-wreathed street below. "Watson, my dear fellow, fetch your greatcoat. Inspector, we shall accompany you to this temple of preserved mortality. If there are indeed whispers to be heard among the waxen figures, I suspect they will prove to be the echoes of a very human deception, one conceived by a mind of considerable cunning and executed with theatrical precision." As we prepared to venture forth into the November night, I found myself reflecting upon the extraordinary tale we had just heard. The image of poor Thorne, frozen in mortal terror before the wax likeness of Holmes's greatest adversary, seemed to embody something more than mere coincidence, as though the very shadows of past conflicts had somehow reached across the boundary between life and death to claim another victim. Little did I know, as we descended to the fog-shrouded street, that we were about to embark upon one of the most perplexing and macabre adventures of our long association, a case that would test not only Holmes's deductive powers, but challenge our very understanding of the boundary between the possible and the impossible, between the realm of the living and the silent, watching world of the waxen dead. The hansom cab that carried us through the fog-shrouded streets of Bloomsbury moved with the cautious deliberation of a vessel navigating treacherous waters. The dense yellow mist that had descended upon London like a malevolent spirit seemed to muffle not only sound, but the very essence of the familiar city, transforming well-known thoroughfares into alien pathways that might have belonged to some phantasmagorical realm. Lestrade sat rigidly beside us, occasionally peering through the small window as though expecting some spectral revelation to emerge from the swirling murk, while the rhythmic clip-clop of our horses' hooves provided the only constant in a world rendered suddenly uncertain. Holmes, however, remained characteristically composed, his sharp profile occasionally illuminated by the feeble glow of passing gas lamps. Yet I observed that his keen mind was already at work, for midway through our journey, he suddenly addressed our driver with that casual precision that invariably preceded his most startling demonstrations. "Tell me, my good fellow," said he, leaning slightly forward, "you have recently taken employment with this particular cab company, have you not? Previously, I should judge, you worked the Surrey routes, where you formed an association with someone at the stables who possesses the unusual habit of mending harness traces with sailmaker's twine rather than conventional leather strapping." The driver's shoulders stiffened with surprise, and he half turned in his seat, his weathered features visible in the lamplight. "Blimey, sir, how could you possibly know that? Aye, it's true enough. Old Jenkins at the Croydon stables. He were a navy man before he took to horses, and he always said sailmaker's twine were stronger than any leather for emergency repairs." Holmes settled back with evident satisfaction. "A mere trifle of observation, I assure you. The slight but distinctive wear pattern on your left rein, where it has been mended with a material of different texture and flexibility than the original leather, tells its own tale to the trained eye." Lestrade shook his head in wonderment. though I detected beneath his amazement a growing appreciation for the methodical precision that Holmes brought to even the smallest mysteries. If you can deduce a man's employment history from his harness leather, Holmes, surely you can make sense of this impossible affair at the museum. Precisely my point, Inspector, Holmes replied, his voice taking on that sharper, more analytical tone that indicated his full engagement with the problem. You present me with a locked room, a man dead of apparent terror, mysterious whispers, and figures that seem to move of their own accord. To the casual observer, these are the hallmarks of supernatural intervention. To the trained investigator, however, they are merely pieces of a puzzle, each as tangible and explicable as the mended rain before us. The challenge lies not in dismissing them as impossible, but in understanding the human agency that has orchestrated such theatrical effects. As if summoned by his words, the imposing facade of the Barlow Institute of Artistic Modeling emerged from the gloom before us, like some Gothic cathedral dedicated to the preservation of mortal forms. The building's ornate stonework and tall windows spoke of Victorian grandeur, yet there was something profoundly unsettling about its appearance in the fog. The way shadows seemed to cling to every architectural detail, transforming decorative flourishes into leering gargoyles and transforming what should have been a temple to art into something far more sinister. A solitary constable stood shivering by the entrance, his breath forming ghostly plumes in the frigid air, his relief at our arrival evident in every line of his posture. "All quiet, sir," he reported to Lestrade, though his eyes darted nervously toward the darkened windows above. "Though I'll confess, Inspector, there's something about this place that sets a man's nerves on edge, fog or no fog." We were admitted through heavy oak doors into a vestibule that immediately proclaimed the establishment's serious artistic pretensions. The walls were lined with portraits of distinguished patrons and framed newspaper clippings extolling the museum's educational values. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability lingered an atmosphere of theatrical menace that seemed to whisper of darker entertainments. Miss Vivian Ashford awaited us in the main gallery, and I was immediately struck by the composed dignity with which she bore her evident distress. A woman of perhaps 30 years, she was dressed in hastily donned mourning attire, her pale complexion and red-rimmed eyes bearing testimony to the shock she had endured. Yet despite her grief, I observed an intelligence and steadiness of character that spoke well of her late employer's judgment. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I cannot adequately express my gratitude for your presence. Poor Mr. Thorne was such a gentle soul, devoted entirely to his art and the education of the public. To think that he should meet such a terrible end in the very place he cherished most. It defies all comprehension." Holmes stepped forward with that peculiar combination of courtesy and professional detachment that characterized his interactions with witnesses. As he did so, I observed his keen gaze cataloguing every detail of the woman before him, the faint chalk dust upon her cuff, the minute smear of carmine along her thumb, the particular way she held her left hand slightly forward. "Miss Ashford, I'm Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague Dr. Watson. I perceive that you are left-handed and have recently been engaged in portrait work. Pastels rather than oils, if I am not mistaken. A child's likeness, perhaps." Her surprise flickered across her features before giving way to a wan smile. "Indeed, Mr. Holmes, I completed a portrait sitting earlier this week in Bloomsbury, a young girl whose parents wished to commemorate her 7th birthday." "Admirable work, no doubt," Holmes replied with genuine warmth before his manner became more businesslike. "Now, Miss Ashford, Inspector Lestrade has acquainted us with the basic circumstances, but I should be most grateful if you would conduct us to the scene of this tragedy. Often the eye that has witnessed the impossible can guide us toward that thread of possibility that others have overlooked." She nodded, gathering her composure with visible effort, and led us through dimly lit corridors where the soft crackle of gas jets provided the only sound. The chamber of horror. announced itself with a chill that seemed independent of the November night, and even I, who have gazed upon scenes that would test the strongest constitution, felt an involuntary tightening of the throat as we crossed its threshold. The chamber itself was a masterwork of macabre artistry, its wax figures arranged with such lifelike precision that they seemed to lean forward from their alcoves as though eager to share the secrets of their infamous deeds. At the room's center sat the mortal remains of Elias Thorne, upright in a plain wooden chair, his hands positioned upon the arms, his features contorted by that dreadful expression Lestrade had described. His eyes stared with glassy intensity at the wax figure of Professor Moriarty, positioned no more than 3 feet distant, its painted features bearing that look of malign intelligence that had once struck terror into the hearts of honest citizens. Holmes did not immediately approach the body, but instead began a careful circuit of the room, his head tilted as though listening for some sound beyond the range of normal hearing. Twice he paused in distinct corners and whispered a single word. To my astonishment, the syllables returned to us from a point directly above the Moriarty figure, as though some invisible mouth had repeated them with perfect clarity. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured, his eyes alight with the pleasure of discovery. A whispering gallery, created by the elliptical geometry of the chamber, whether by accident or design matters little. Sound projected from certain points will focus at others with remarkable clarity. Not spirits, Lestrade, but simple acoustics. He knelt beside Thorne's body at last, producing his magnifying lens and examining the deceased with that methodical thoroughness that had solved so many seemingly insoluble mysteries. The wax upon the eyelids and lips has been applied with considerable skill. Observe the feathered edge, Watson, and the upward stroke upon the lashes. This was done by a practiced hand. His nostrils flared slightly. Interesting, this is not pure beeswax, but contains a tallow admixture and something aromatic. Storax, perhaps. Miss Ashford, does your establishment employ such a mixture in its figures? No, Mr. Holmes, she replied with evident puzzlement. Mr. Thorne insisted upon the finest beeswax blend available. He would never have compromised the quality of his materials. Precisely as I suspected, Holmes said, rising and indicating with his forefinger a pale crescent upon the floor between the chair and the Moriarty effigy. Observe this recent scuff mark upon the tiles, and here. He held up a gossamer thread no longer than an inch, caught in a joint of the pedestal. Strong enough to create movement in dim light, yet fine enough to escape casual observation. Lestrade bent to examine the evidence. Fishing line? Possibly. Certainly sufficient to suggest far more dramatic movement than actually occurred. Holmes moved to the Moriarty pedestal and pressed his palm against its base. "Warm," he announced quietly. "And there is a faint odor of coal gas. There must be some void behind this wall, a vent, a flue, or perhaps something more deliberately constructed." The pieces of an elaborate deception were beginning to reveal themselves, yet the full scope of the conspiracy remained tantalizingly beyond our grasp. As Holmes continued his methodical examination, I found myself wondering what manner of mind could conceive such an intricate web of illusion, and what dark purpose it was intended to serve. Holmes's examination of the warm pedestal revealed layers of deception that spoke to a mind of considerable cunning and theatrical flair. His fingers traced the subtle joinery with the delicacy of a master craftsman, and as he crouched to examine the base more closely, his nostrils flared slightly at a scent that seemed incongruous with the museum's usual atmosphere. "The warmth emanates from within," he murmured, his voice barely disturbing the chamber's oppressive silence. "And with it comes the distinct aroma of storax, a resin employed in certain religious ceremonies and theatrical productions, but never, I venture, in the creation of museum-quality wax figures." He glanced meaningfully at Miss Ashford, who shook her head in confirmation of his assumption. Rising gracefully, Holmes indicated a hairline crack that ran along the pedestal's base, so expertly concealed that it would escape all but the most trained observation. This is no solid mounting, gentlemen, but a cunningly constructed chamber, complete with its own heating apparatus. The coal gas scent suggests a connection to the building's supply system, though whether legitimate or clandestinely installed remains to be determined. At Holmes's request, Lestrade summoned the night watchman, and Timothy Morse entered with the bearing of a man who had witnessed events that challenged his understanding of the natural world. His weathered features bore the stamp of military service, yet his eyes held a haunted quality that spoke to recent experiences beyond his comprehension. "Tell us precisely what you heard and observed, Mr. Morse," Holmes instructed with gentle authority. "Spare no detail, however insignificant it may seem." The old soldier straightened his shoulders. "At near midnight by my pocket watch, sir, I heard what I can only describe as whispers. Not the natural conversation of two persons, but a single voice that seemed to slide along the very walls themselves. When I investigated this chamber, I found it empty of human presence, yet there was that sweet, churchy smell hanging in the air like incense after a service." "Did you touch anything during your inspection?" Holmes inquired. Morse flushed slightly. "Aye, sir, I did. That pedestal there felt warm beneath my palm, warmer than the night air warranted. And there was a draught upon my cheek, though I could see no open window or vent to account for it." Holmes nodded thoughtfully before turning his attention to the figures Miss Ashford had mentioned as being mysteriously repositioned. His examination of Napoleon's pedestal revealed minute traces of coarse sawdust beneath the figure's left boot, quite distinct from the fine dust that naturally accumulated on the museum's polished floors. "Observe, Watson," he said, indicating an almost imperceptible drag mark in the wood beneath the massive pedestal. "These figures, despite their considerable weight, have been moved with remarkable precision. The sawdust suggests the use of rollers or similar mechanical aids, while this scoring indicates controlled movement rather than brute force." Moving to the Lady Macbeth figure, Holmes produced his magnifying lens and examined the floor around its base with characteristic thoroughness. "No sawdust here," he noted, "but observe this slight indentation where the pedestal's forward edge would rest if pivoted on its axis." From near the base, he extracted with his tweezers a fragment so small as to be nearly invisible, a sliver of metal that caught the gaslight with a dull gleam. "Piano wire," he announced after brief examination. "Strong enough to exert considerable tension, yet fine enough to escape casual observation. Our theatrical friend has employed mechanical principles to create the illusion of supernatural animation. The figures have not moved of their own accord, but have been subtly manipulated by someone with considerable knowledge of leverage and mechanical advantage." Lestrade scratched his head in bewilderment. "But to what purpose, Holmes, and how could such elaborate preparations be made without detection?" "Ah, Inspector, therein lies the artistry of our unknown adversary," Holmes replied, his eyes alight with professional appreciation for the criminal mind at work. "They have transformed this entire establishment into a stage for psychological manipulation, employing the museum's own atmosphere of silent watchfulness to create an environment of supernatural dread. The whispering acoustics, the moving figures, the theatrical death of poor Thorne, these are not random acts of malice, but carefully orchestrated components of a larger design." Miss Ashford, who had been listening with growing pallor, suddenly spoke. "Mr. Holmes, there is something I perhaps should have mentioned earlier. Mr. Thorne dismissed one of our most skilled artisans a fortnight ago, Mr. Corin Barlow, who created the Moriarty figure, among others. The parting was not amicable. Mr. Barlow was intemperate in his language regarding his dismissal." Holmes's attention sharpened immediately. "The circumstances of this dismissal, Miss Ashford?" "A disagreement over artistic methods and, I believe, certain financial arrangements. Mr. Barlow felt his talents were undervalued, and he made no secret of his resentment." He possessed intimate knowledge of every figure in our collection, having worked on most of them personally. Moreover, he was familiar with the building's architecture, having spent countless hours in every chamber and corridor during his employment. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, filing this information with the precision of a master cataloguer. A dismissed artisan with both motive and opportunity, possessed of the technical skills necessary to orchestrate such elaborate deceptions. Yet I suspect there are deeper currents at work here, gentlemen. The death of Mr. Thorne was not merely an act of revenge, but served some larger purpose that we have yet to fathom. He paused in his examination to study the acoustic properties of the chamber once more, speaking a single word in various corners and noting how the elliptical architecture focused sound at specific points. The killer understood not only the mechanical aspects of their deception, but the psychological impact of disembodied voices and supernatural suggestions. They have created a perfect storm of fear and confusion designed to mask their true objective while eliminating poor Thorne as an obstacle to their plans. As we prepared to examine other areas of the museum, Holmes cast one final glance at the grotesque tableau before us. The dead man frozen in terror before the wax likeness of his greatest enemy. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall delve deeper into Mr. Barlow's current circumstances and recent activities. I suspect we shall find that his artistic talents extend far beyond the creation of wax figures, into realms of deception that would challenge even the most accomplished theatrical performer. The pieces of an elaborate puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in Holmes's mind, yet I sense that the full scope of the conspiracy remained tantalizingly beyond our grasp. As we left the Chamber of Horrors, I could not shake the feeling that we were dealing with a criminal whose ambitions extended far beyond simple revenge. Someone whose ultimate objective would prove as shocking as the method by which poor Thorne had met his end. Holmes's insistence upon examining Thorne's private office proved as illuminating as our investigation of the Chamber of Horrors itself. Miss Ashford led us through a narrow corridor lined with storage alcoves, each containing the tools and materials of the wax sculptor's craft, until we reached a modest chamber that overlooked the museum's interior courtyard. The office bore the stamp of a methodical mind, ledgers arranged with military precision, correspondence filed by date, and a small collection of reference works on anatomy and artistic technique occupying a single bookshelf. Yet it was Holmes's examination of the seemingly innocent windowsill that yielded our first tangible evidence of the conspiracy we had begun to suspect. A shallow metal tray, no larger than a dinner plate, rested beneath the window, its surface coated with a pale, waxy residue that caught the morning light with an oily sheen. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, scraping a small sample with his penknife and holding it to his nostrils. "The same storax and tallow mixture we discovered upon poor Thorne's person, yet here it appears to have been prepared in quantity." He struck a match and held it beneath the sample until it began to soften, releasing that distinctive balsamic sweetness we had detected in the Chamber of Horrors. Miss Ashford watched this demonstration with evident bewilderment. "I can assure you, Mr. Holmes, that Mr. Thorne never employed such materials in his work. He was most particular about the purity of his wax compounds and would never have permitted anything with such a pronounced odor in his workspace." Holmes nodded thoughtfully before turning his attention to Thorne's business ledger, its leather binding worn smooth by years of careful handling. As he leafed through the recent entries, his keen eyes detected what lesser observers might have missed entirely, a single line that had been carefully razored from the page, leaving only the faintest indentation in the paper beneath. Holding the ledger at an angle to catch the lamplight, Holmes read aloud the ghostly impression left by the missing entry. "C. Barlow, advance payment. Alterations to ventilation system, 10 guineas. The date appears to be 9 days past. Lestrade leaned forward with interest. So Barlow had legitimate business here after his dismissal? Or was paid to ensure his silence regarding certain modifications he had made? Holmes replied, his voice carrying that note of satisfaction that always accompanied the discovery of a crucial link in his chain of reasoning. The question remains whether these alterations were made with Thorne's knowledge and consent, or through more clandestine means. Our answer came when Holmes began a systematic examination of the office's architectural features, his knuckles traveling along the wainscoting until a distinctly hollow note answered his percussion. With Miss Ashford's permission, he worked the blade of his penknife into what appeared to be ordinary decorative molding, revealing hidden hinges that allowed an entire panel to swing open on well-oiled pivots. The narrow shaft thus revealed extended both upward and downward into the building's hidden spaces, its interior warmed by a small gas jet mounted on an iron bracket. The air within carried that familiar blend of coal gas and storax, while the floor bore clear evidence of recent occupation. A coil of dark wire lay partially concealed beneath a layer of dust, and a brass speaking tube had been mounted with obvious care near the shaft's rear wall. Ingenious, Holmes observed, lifting the wire for our examination. Strong enough to manipulate a heavy figure through mechanical advantage, yet fine enough to escape casual detection. And here, he indicated the speaking tube with evident appreciation for its craftsmanship, a means of projecting voice to any point connected to this system. Combined with the chamber's natural acoustic properties, one could create the illusion of supernatural communication from any number of concealed positions. Holmes crouched to examine the shaft's floor more closely, his magnifying lens revealing details that would have escaped ordinary observation. Square-toed heel prints with a distinctive nick on the outer quarter of the left foot. Not military issue, but the heavy construction favored by artisans who spend long hours standing at their work. Timothy Morse, who had followed us with the fascination of a man witnessing the systematic demolition of his supernatural fears, cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Barlow did wear square-toed boots, sir, stout ones as befitted his trade. I cannot swear to the nick, but the size and shape match my recollection. Returning to the office proper, Holmes subjected Thorne's correspondence to the same methodical scrutiny he had applied to the physical evidence. Amid the usual commercial correspondence, bills from suppliers, inquiries from potential visitors, routine administrative matters, he discovered a document that cast our investigation in an entirely new light. An insurance policy, he announced, passing the paper to me with a meaningful glance. Taken out a mere fortnight ago, increasing the coverage on principal exhibits and fittings by a factor of 3. Most interesting timing, considering the subsequent events. The implications were staggering. What had appeared to be an act of supernatural vengeance was revealing itself as something far more calculated, a crime designed not merely to eliminate poor Thorne, but to create conditions that would serve the perpetrator's larger financial objectives. Holmes turned to Miss Ashford with that grave courtesy that characterized his interactions with witnesses whose testimony might prove crucial. I must ask you to consider most carefully, Miss Ashford. Did Mr. Barlow ever express interest in acquiring the museum property, or did he make any inquiries regarding its potential value or availability for purchase? Her face paled as the significance of the question became clear. He often spoke of establishing his own exhibition, Mr. Holmes. He felt that his artistic vision was constrained by Mr. Thorne's conservative approach to the medium. He once remarked that this building would be ideal for his purposes, given its reputation and established clientele. And the basement levels? Holmes pressed. What lies beneath the exhibition floors? Extensive storage areas, sir. Mr. Thorne often joked that we possessed more space below ground than above. The original building was constructed with deep foundations to accommodate the weight of the exhibits, and subsequent renovations have created a maze of chambers and corridors that even I have not fully explored. Holmes exchanged a significant glance with me before addressing our small group with that air of authority that marked his moments of greatest insight. Gentlemen, I believe we are dealing with a conspiracy of considerably greater scope than a simple act of revenge. The elaborate supernatural deceptions, the carefully timed insurance increase, the systematic preparation of hidden mechanisms. These suggest a plan designed to acquire this property under circumstances that would minimize both cost and official scrutiny. As if summoned by his words, a faint sibilance crept along the corridor, so soft that one might have mistaken it for the whisper of gas through the building's pipes. Miss Ashford started and clasped her hands together, while Lestrade's fingers moved instinctively toward his service revolver. Holmes, however, merely lifted a finger for silence, stepped to a specific corner of the wainscoting, and spoke a single, clear word. The syllable returned to us from the hidden shaft with eerie precision, as though some invisible presence had repeated it with perfect clarity. "Sound conducted through the speaking tube system," Holmes explained with evident satisfaction. "The apparatus has been used recently. The acoustic signature confirms it. Someone has been employing these hidden channels to create the illusion of supernatural communication, using the building's own architecture as an instrument of psychological manipulation." The morning light streaming through the office windows seemed suddenly ominous rather than reassuring, as though the very clarity of day might serve our enemy's purposes by revealing our movements to watching eyes. Holmes's expression had taken on that intense, calculating quality that always preceded his most decisive actions. "Miss Ashford," he said with quiet authority, "you must lock these premises and admit no one without Inspector Lestrade's express permission. Under no circumstances should you venture into the lower levels alone. Our adversaries have demonstrated remarkable cunning in their preparations, and I suspect they are already aware of our investigation." As we prepared to depart for our confrontation with Corinne Barlow, I reflected upon the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in our understanding of the case. What had begun as an impossible crime in a locked chamber had revealed itself as merely the visible portion of an elaborate conspiracy, one whose full scope and ultimate objective remained tantalizingly beyond our complete comprehension, yet whose general outline was beginning to emerge with terrifying clarity. Our pursuit of Corinne Barlow led us through the labyrinthine streets of Clerkenwell, where the fog seemed to press more closely against the grimy windows of workshops and tenements, muffling the sounds of industry that marked this quarter as the domain of London's skilled artisans. The address Miss Ashford had provided proved to be a narrow building wedged between a tinsmith's establishment and a bookbinder's shop, its facade bearing the accumulated grime of decades, yet maintaining a certain dignity that spoke of respectable, if modest, circumstances. Holmes had maintained an thoughtful silence during our journey, his keen eyes occasionally catching details that escaped my notice. The particular quality of smoke rising from certain chimneys, the manner in which pedestrians navigated the fog-shrouded pavements, the subtle variations in architectural style that marked the transition from one district to another. I sensed that his mind was already constructing elaborate scenarios, anticipating the various forms our confrontation with Barlow might take. A brass plate beside the entrance, recently polished yet already bearing the inevitable specks of London's perpetual soot, announced C. Barlow, artistic modeler, in letters that proclaimed both professional pride and financial necessity. Lestrade's official knock brought a response from within. Footsteps that seemed to hesitate before approaching the door, as though the occupant was weighing the wisdom of acknowledging our presence. The man who eventually appeared before us bore the unmistakable stamp of the artistic temperament, yet tempered by the practical considerations of one who must earn his living through skilled manual labor. Corinne Barlow possessed the broad, capable hands of a craftsman, their surfaces bearing the characteristic burns and stains that marked long association with heated wax and chemical compounds. His dark hair sprang untamed from a narrow brow, while his eyes, keen and intelligent, yet holding a wariness that bordered on suspicion, took in our small party with an expression that seemed almost defiant. "You come about Thorne?" he said without preamble, his voice carrying a roughness that suggested either recent disuse or carefully controlled emotion. "I saw the notice in the morning papers. I'll not pretend grief for the man." He dismissed me without proper notice and showed no consideration for my artistic vision. Holmes stepped forward with that peculiar combination of courtesy and authority that characterized his approach to potentially hostile witnesses. "You will, however, permit us to enter, Mr. Barlow. There are certain matters regarding Mr. Thorne's death that require clarification, and I believe you may possess information relevant to our investigation." The workshop that lay beyond the threshold was a cramped yet efficiently organized space that spoke to its occupants' professional competence and artistic aspirations. Workbenches lined the walls, their scarred surfaces bearing testimony to years of intensive creative endeavor, while an impressive array of specialized tools hung from wooden pegs in arrangements that proclaimed both expertise and careful maintenance. The air carried the familiar blend of beeswax and turpentine that characterized the sculptor's trade, yet beneath these expected odors lurked something sweeter and more complex, the distinctive storax scent we had encountered at the museum. Holmes allowed his gaze to travel methodically across the workshop's contents, his trained observation cataloguing details that would escape ordinary notice. "You have been engaged in theatrical work recently," he remarked with casual precision, indicating a coiled length of blackened cordage marked with pink rosin and bearing a paper tag stamped with the legend "Princess's Theatre, Property." "Stage effects, I should judge, requiring both mechanical expertise and artistic sensibility." Barlow's defensive posture relaxed slightly, replaced by what appeared to be professional pride. "Trap-doors and flying apparatus for the current production. The work pays considerably better than creating static figures for museum display, and it allows for genuine artistic innovation. I was there until well past 1 o'clock this morning, completing the dress rehearsal preparations." Lestrade produced his notebook with evident interest. "You can provide names of witnesses to your presence?" "Certainly. Mr. Hugh Dallin, the stage manager, and Mr. Kerridge, the chief mechanist, along with half a dozen carpenters and stagehands. We ran the complete dress rehearsal twice to ensure all effects functioned properly." Barlow moved to a peg near the door and produced a pasteboard pass bearing an official stamp. Mr. Dallin's authorization, dated and timed. While this exchange proceeded, Holmes had drifted toward a pair of square-toed boots that stood with military precision beside the workshop's entrance. I observed him crouch briefly to examine the left boot's outer quarter, where a shallow, triangular nick was clearly visible in the worn leather. His nostrils flared slightly as he detected some trace upon the boot's surface, and I noted his glance toward a shelf where a cracked, obviously discarded boot lay beside a tin of repair cement. Moving to examine the main workbench, Holmes discovered a small brown vial bearing the label "Capper and Sons, Drury Lane, Storax." Barlow, observing my friend's interest, offered an explanation that carried the ring of practiced justification. "Theatrical incense for a temple scene in the current production. The management requires us to purchase from economical suppliers rather than the more expensive chemists. Capper's establishment provides adequate quality at reasonable cost." "Economical, yet possessing quite distinctive properties," Holmes murmured, his attention shifting to a collection of rolled drawings secured with waxed twine. One roll bore a smudge of Prussian blue at its edge, and when Holmes lifted it with apparent casualness, I caught a glimpse of the unmistakable azure coloring of a cyano-type blueprint. He unrolled it no farther than necessary to reveal margin notations in a precise, educated hand before allowing it to fall among the others with studied indifference. Yet I observed that a small torn corner, no larger than a postage stamp, remained adherent to his glove as he turned away. Lestrade, meanwhile, had been pursuing his own line of inquiry with characteristic directness. "Your quarrel with Thorne is well documented, Mr. Barlow, yet he paid you 10 guineas a mere 9 days ago for what his ledger described as alterations to the ventilation system. Why would such an entry be subsequently removed unless it concealed activities of questionable legitimacy?" Barlow's expression grew defensive. yet his explanation carried sufficient detail to suggest truthfulness. Thorne was obsessed with maintaining the reputation of his establishment. He commissioned me to install heating apparatus for his so-called whispering marvel, the acoustic effects in the Chamber of Horrors, but swore me to secrecy lest visitors accuse him of employing artificial means to create supernatural impressions. He feared adverse publicity more than financial loss. Holmes ceased his examination of the workshop's contents and fixed Barlow with that penetrating stare that had unnerved countless subjects of investigation. "And on the night of Mr. Thorne's death, you did not venture near the Bloomsbury district?" "I have told you, I was at the Princess's Theatre from 11 o'clock until well past 1 in the morning." Barlow's voice carried a note of growing irritation. "The stage manager's pass bears the date and time, and there were numerous witnesses to my presence throughout the evening." "Indeed," Holmes replied with a slight inclination of his head. "Inspector, I believe we should verify these claims before proceeding further." Our subsequent visit to the Princess's Theatre provided confirmation that proved both reassuring and troubling in equal measure. Mr. Dallon, a brisk gentleman with the authoritative manner characteristic of his profession, vouched for Barlow's presence without hesitation, as did the mechanist Kerridge, an honest, capable fellow whose pocket watch, produced with evident pride, had been set by the General Post Office clock that very morning. They spoke in convincing detail of Barlow's work on the gridiron and beneath the stage, including his visible frustration when a pulley mechanism fouled during the evening's preparations. Outside the theatre, Lestrade's mounting frustration broke through his habitual professional restraint. "The man's boots match your description. His workshop reeks of the same compounds found on Thorne's body. His mechanical skills are beyond question, yet he possesses what appears to be an unshakable alibi." Holmes signaled for a hansom cab with that air of quiet satisfaction that often preceded his most significant revelations. "An alibi, my dear Lestrade, is most formidable when it rests upon genuine foundation, and most vulnerable when it serves to shield only one participant in a larger conspiracy. I suggest you refrain from arresting Mr. Barlow for the present, but arrange for discreet surveillance of his movements. If he is innocent of direct involvement, we lose nothing by observation. If he is guilty, we may gain knowledge of his confederates." As our cab began its journey toward Holborn, Holmes produced the small fragment of blue paper he had retrieved from Barlow's workshop, turning it thoughtfully between his fingers. "Watson, there is a gentleman whose acquaintance I am most eager to make. Mr. Armitage of Lloyd and Armitage, underwriters. Insurance coverage is not increased threefold upon mere whim, and I suspect we shall find that Mr. Thorne's sudden concern for protecting his investment was prompted by advice from sources whose motives bear careful examination." The afternoon light filtering through London's perpetual haze seemed to carry with it a sense of gathering complexity, as though the simple mystery of a man's death in a locked chamber was revealing itself to be merely the visible portion of a conspiracy whose true dimensions remained tantalizingly beyond our complete comprehension. Holmes's manner suggested that the game was now truly afoot, and that our investigation was about to enter a phase where the stakes would prove considerably higher than any of us had initially anticipated. The offices of Lloyd and Armitage occupied a position of considerable respectability in Lombard Street, their brass nameplate bearing the patina of decades spent in the careful assessment of risk and the methodical distribution of financial responsibility. The establishment's interior reflected the conservative principles upon which such enterprises were founded. Polished mahogany counters, leather-bound ledgers arranged with mathematical precision, and an atmosphere of quiet competence that spoke to the serious nature of the business conducted within these walls. Mr. Reginald Armitage himself received us in a private office whose every detail proclaimed the methodical mind of a man who had spent his professional life reducing the uncertainties of human existence to columns of figures and calculated probabilities. He was a thin, precise gentleman of middle years, his iron-grey whiskers meticulously maintained, his clothing bearing that particular combination of quality and restraint that marked the successful professional man. Yet I observed that Holmes's keen gaze detected details that would escape ordinary notice. A faint dusting of brick powder upon his cuff, the slight callus upon his thumb that spoke of extensive penwork, and most significantly, a barely perceptible blue smudge along the edge of his blotter. "Gentlemen," Armitage began with the measured courtesy of his profession, "I understand you wish to discuss the policy recently increased for Mr. Elias Thorne. A most unusual case, I must confess, both in its timing and the specific nature of the coverage. Requested." Holmes leaned forward with that intense interest that invariably preceded his most significant discoveries. "Unusual in what particular respects, Mr. Armitage?" "Mr. Thorne approached us some 3 weeks past in a state of considerable agitation," Armitage replied, consulting a leather-bound file with practiced efficiency. He spoke of what he termed supernatural manifestations that had begun occurring within his establishment. Whispers in empty chambers, figures that appeared to move of their own accord, unexplained temperature variations in specific areas of the building. Most remarkably, he requested coverage that would protect him against what he called malicious supernatural interference and its potential impact upon his business. The implications struck me with the force of revelation. What we had assumed to be the aftermath of Thorne's death was revealing itself as a systematic campaign of psychological intimidation that had preceded his demise by several weeks. The elaborate mechanisms Holmes had discovered were not hastily constructed instruments of revenge, but components of a carefully orchestrated effort to drive the museum proprietor to distraction and ultimately to his doom. He was experiencing these phenomena for weeks before his death, Lestrade inquired, his notebook at the ready. "Indeed, Inspector, Mr. Thorne described a pattern of increasingly disturbing incidents that had begun to affect both his peace of mind and his establishment's reputation. He feared that word of supernatural activity would drive away his clientele and destroy the respectability he had spent years establishing." Holmes had been examining the blue smudge upon Armitage's blotter with apparent casualness, yet I recognized the signs of his intense concentration. The assessment of the property. Who conducted this evaluation? "Our standard procedure required an independent survey before approving such a substantial increase in coverage. Mr. Quarmby, the broker who handled the transaction, recommended Mr. Pritchard, an assessor with considerable experience in unusual properties. His report was quite thorough, noting extensive modifications to the building's original structure that he described as ingenious yet inexplicable." From his waistcoat pocket, Holmes produced the small fragment of blue paper he had retrieved from Barlow's workshop, placing it with studied casualness upon Armitage's desk. The underwriter's eyes widened as he recognized the distinctive characteristics of architectural documentation. "This appears to be a portion of the cyanotype plans prepared for our assessment," Armitage observed with evident surprise. "How did you come by this fragment, Mr. Holmes?" "It was discovered in circumstances that suggest Mr. Pritchard's survey may have served purposes beyond simple risk assessment," Holmes replied with characteristic precision. "Tell me, Mr. Armitage, did Mr. Thorne mention receiving any offers to purchase his property during this period of supernatural harassment?" Armitage consulted his correspondence file with growing unease. He did indeed. Mr. Thorne spoke of approaches from what he termed theatrical interests, parties who seemed remarkably well informed about his establishment's recent difficulties and who suggested that a sale might relieve him of his supernatural burdens. The timing struck him as highly suspicious. And the identity of these interested parties? He was reluctant to provide specifics, but he did mention that the negotiations were being conducted through Mr. Silas Quarmby, the same broker who had arranged his insurance increase. Mr. Thorne found this coincidence deeply troubling. Holmes rose from his chair with that air of purposeful energy that invariably preceded his most decisive actions. The pattern was becoming clear. a conspiracy that employed supernatural theatre to create the conditions necessary for a profitable acquisition, with the victim's own insurance coverage providing the means to legitimize the ultimate crime. "Mr. Armitage," Holmes said with quiet authority, "I shall require copies of all documentation related to this matter, the original assessment, correspondence with Mr. Quarmby, and any communications regarding potential purchases. Inspector Lestrade will provide the necessary authorization." As we prepared to depart, Armitage cleared his throat with evident nervousness. "There is one additional matter, gentlemen. This morning we received notification that a claim will be filed regarding Mr. Thorne's death. The solicitor indicated that the circumstances, occurring as they did during documented supernatural manifestations, constitute clear evidence of the very phenomena against which Mr. Thorne had sought protection. The audacity of the scheme was breathtaking in its scope and calculation. Our adversaries had not merely engineered Thorne's death, but had created the documentary foundation necessary to profit from their crime through entirely legitimate channels. The supernatural manifestations, the increased insurance coverage, the carefully timed death, all were components of an elaborate financial conspiracy that transformed murder into a business transaction. Outside the offices, as our hansom cab navigated the afternoon traffic, Holmes's expression bore that combination of professional admiration and moral outrage that characterized his reaction to particularly sophisticated criminal enterprises. "Watson, we are confronting adversaries whose planning extends far beyond the immediate crime. They have anticipated not merely our investigation, but the legal and financial consequences of their actions. The death of poor Thorne was not the culmination of their scheme, but merely one component in a larger design whose ultimate objective we are only beginning to comprehend." The fog that had shrouded London throughout our investigation seemed to thicken as evening approached. Yet I sensed that Holmes's understanding of our case was beginning to pierce through the obscurity that had initially surrounded it. The human calculations that lay beneath the supernatural facade were revealing themselves with increasing clarity, and I anticipated that our next moves would bring us face to face with the master manipulator who had orchestrated this elaborate deception. "Our immediate priority," Holmes continued, "must be to locate Mr. Quarmby and Mr. Pritchard before they become aware of our interest in their activities. If they are indeed the architects of this conspiracy, they will not hesitate to eliminate any evidence or witnesses that might implicate them in Thorne's death." As our cab turned toward Gray's Inn, where Holmes intended to investigate the solicitor handling the insurance claim, I reflected upon the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in our understanding of the case. What had begun as an impossible crime in a locked chamber had revealed itself as merely the visible portion of a conspiracy whose tentacles reached into the highest levels of London's financial and legal establishments, a web of deception so intricate that its full extent remained tantalizingly beyond our complete comprehension. Our pursuit of the conspiracy's legal foundations led us through the fog-shrouded passages of Gray's Inn, where the ancient chambers of Messrs. Grimsby and Finch occupied a position of quiet respectability among the legal profession's most established practitioners. Mr. Edmund Swithin, the senior partner, received us in chambers that bore the accumulated dignity of decades spent in the careful administration of estates and the methodical resolution of testamentary disputes. Swithin proved to be a precise gentleman whose careful hands and habit of aligning his pen with mathematical precision spoke to a mind trained in the exacting requirements of legal documentation. Yet I observed that Holmes's penetrating gaze detected subtle signs of recent agitation, a faint tremor in the solicitor's fingers, a barely perceptible blue smudge upon his blotter, and most significantly, the lingering trace of that distinctive storax scent we had encountered throughout our investigation. "Gentlemen," Swithin began with cautious formality, "I understand you wish to discuss the estate of the late Mr. Elias Thorne, a most regrettable affair, complicated by the unusual circumstances of his demise and certain financial arrangements that preceded his death." Holmes leaned forward with that intense interest that invariably preceded his most significant discoveries. "Financial arrangements, Mr. Swithin?" "Indeed. Mr. Thorne executed a property option merely 8 days before his death, granting purchase rights to the Metropolitan Theatrical Syndicate. The document was witnessed by Mr. Pritchard, the insurance assessor, in the presence of Mr. Quarmby, who served as the syndicate's agent." Swithin produced a blue-tinted deed from his files, its formal language bearing the weight of legal authority, yet somehow conveying an atmosphere of coercion rather than voluntary agreement. Holmes examined the document with characteristic thoroughness, his nostrils flaring slightly as he detected the familiar aromatic traces. "You perceive, Watson, the minute darkening at the ribbon's edge? Storax again. And observe how the signature trails, the final flourish broken, quite unlike Mr. Thorne's customary firm hand. The implications were staggering. The supernatural harassment that had driven Thorne to increase his insurance coverage had culminated in a legal document that would transfer his property to the very parties who had orchestrated his torment. The signature's tremulous quality suggested a man signing under extreme duress, his hand guided by terror rather than free will. "The beneficiary of Mr. Thorne's estate," Swithin continued with evident reluctance, "is a distant cousin, Mrs. Penelope Thorne of Brighton. She stands to inherit considerable assets, including the insurance settlement, yet has expressed willingness to honor the option agreement rather than contest its validity." Holmes's eyes narrowed as the financial architecture of the conspiracy became clear. "A most accommodating relative. I presume Mr. Quarmby facilitated this introduction as well." Before Swithin could respond, a junior clerk entered bearing 2 urgent communications that would transform our understanding of the evening's stakes. The first, a telegram from Quarmby himself, bore the terse message: "Pritchard detained. Proceed inspection this night 9 o'clock. Side entrance, keys at discretion. Have authority ready." The second communication, addressed to me personally, bore Miss Ashford's trembling handwriting. "Whispers resumed. Morse missing from rounds. Lantern seen below. I am alone. Pray advise immediate assistance." Holmes rose with that purposeful energy that marked his moments of greatest resolve. "Mr. Swithin, you will prepare authorization naming Inspector Lestrade to act in your stead, with my name as consulting agent to the police. Our adversaries have accelerated their timeline, which suggests they fear discovery of their elaborate deception." The pattern was now unmistakably clear. A conspiracy that had employed supernatural theater to create the psychological conditions necessary for profitable acquisition, with the victim's own insurance coverage providing legitimacy to their ultimate crime. The evening's inspection would serve as the final act in their macabre drama. Yet Holmes's expression suggested he intended to provide a conclusion quite different from what our enemies anticipated. "Inspector," Holmes continued, "your men must reach the museum immediately. Miss Ashford's safety is paramount, and the gas supply must be secured before 9 o'clock. If our adversaries intend to employ their heating apparatus for more than mere theatrical effects, we shall deny them the means of conflagration." As we prepared to depart Gray's Inn, Holmes paused to examine once more the blue-tinted cyanotype plans that had guided Pritchard's assessment. These marginalia, duct A to gallery, jet behind profile, represent not mere surveying notations, but the technical specifications for an elaborate stage upon which murder was transformed into supernatural spectacle. The fog that pressed against the chamber's windows seemed to thicken as evening approached, yet I sensed that Holmes's understanding of our adversary's methods had achieved perfect clarity. The human calculations that lay beneath the ghostly facade were revealing themselves with mathematical precision, and I anticipated that our confrontation with the master manipulators would test not only our deductive powers, but our ability to prevent a crime whose scope extended far beyond the death of one unfortunate museum proprietor. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, as our hansom began its urgent journey toward Bloomsbury. "We face adversaries whose theatrical ambitions have transformed murder into performance art. Tonight we shall provide them with a final act they did not anticipate, one in which justice, rather than profit, claims the stage." Our return to the Whispering Wax Museum through the fog-shrouded streets of Bloomsbury carried with it the weight of impending confrontation, as though the very atmosphere had thickened not merely with London's perpetual mist, but with the accumulated tensions of our investigation. Holmes had spent the journey in characteristic silence, his keen mind undoubtedly orchestrating the tactical considerations that would determine whether justice or criminal cunning would prevail in the evening's final act. Upon our arrival, Holmes immediately demonstrated that methodical precision which had served us so well in previous cases of similar complexity. "Inspector," said he, addressing Lestrade with quiet authority, "your men must secure the gas main before all else. I have taken the liberty of summoning Mr. Hartwell from the Gas, Light and Coke Company. He awaits your authorization to seal the building supply at the street connection." The efficiency with which these preparations proceeded spoke to Holmes's comprehensive understanding of our adversary's methods. Within minutes, the main gas supply had been turned off, the meters sealed with official lead tags, and strategic points throughout the building equipped with buckets of sand and water. Wet cloths were distributed among the constables, while Lestrade positioned his men at every conceivable point of entry or escape. Miss Ashford met us at the main entrance, her composure admirable despite the evident strain of her solitary vigil within the increasingly hostile confines of the museum. "The whispers have grown more frequent since sunset," she reported with carefully controlled emotion. "Mr. Morse failed to complete his evening rounds. I discovered his lantern still burning beside the entrance to the storage chambers, but of the man himself, no trace." Holmes's expression grew grave at this intelligence. "You have done well to maintain your position, Miss Ashford. Inspector Lestrade will escort you to safety while Dr. Watson and I investigate the lower levels. Under no circumstances must you remain within these walls. Our adversaries have demonstrated a ruthless disregard for innocent life." The basement levels of the Whispering Wax Museum revealed architectural complexities that spoke to decades of systematic modification and expansion. What had begun as simple storage cellars had been transformed into a labyrinthine network of chambers and corridors, their brick walls bearing the accumulated moisture of London's underground streams, while an elaborate system of gas jets provided islands of flickering illumination in an ocean of impenetrable shadow. Holmes's trained observation immediately detected the signs of recent occupation that lesser minds might have overlooked entirely: scuff marks in the accumulated brick dust, the lingering trace of storax and heated wax, and most significantly, a comprehensive arrangement of speaking tubes that connected the basement chambers to various strategic points throughout the building above. The system's sophistication spoke to planning that extended far beyond simple theatrical effects, suggesting instead a network designed to monitor and manipulate every aspect of the museum's acoustic environment. "Observe, Watson," Holmes murmured, tracing the tube system's branching pathways with evident professional admiration. Every conversation, every footstep, every whispered confidence within these walls could be monitored from this central listening post. Our adversaries have transformed the entire establishment into an instrument of surveillance and psychological manipulation. A faint groan from the chamber's far corner drew our immediate attention, and there we discovered Timothy Morse, bound with theatrical cordage and bearing the effects of a calculated assault upon his consciousness. The old soldier was conscious but groggy, his weathered features reflecting the confusion of a man who had witnessed events that challenged his understanding of natural law. "They came like phantoms through the very walls," Morse whispered hoarsely as Holmes worked to free his bonds with characteristic efficiency. "Voices from empty air, figures moving in chambers I knew to be vacant. 3 of them, sir. The tall gentleman with workman's hands, the nervous fellow with the brass instruments, and one I recognized as Mr. Barlow himself. They spoke of timing, 9 o'clock precisely, when something about final ignition and completing the transformation. Holmes's examination of the basement's hidden infrastructure revealed the full scope of our adversary's elaborate deception. A sophisticated gas distribution system connected to every heating jet throughout the building, controlled by a series of valves that could flood specific chambers with combustible vapor on command. The mechanical precision of the installation spoke to professional expertise, while its concealment within the building's legitimate infrastructure demonstrated planning that extended over many months. Pritchard's assessment provided the technical foundation, Holmes observed, examining the valve system's brass fittings with his magnifying lens. Every modification appears in his architectural survey, disguised as improvements to the heating and ventilation systems. The insurance increase was not merely financial preparation, but documentary evidence that the building's enhanced value justified the elaborate means employed in its acquisition. Moving deeper into the basement complex, we discovered the central apparatus of their conspiracy, a sophisticated mechanical system employing pulleys, counterweights, and piano wire to create the illusion of supernatural animation among the wax figures above. The precision of the installation spoke to Barlow's theatrical expertise, while its integration with the gas and acoustic systems demonstrated a level of coordination that could only have been achieved through months of careful preparation. "They have transformed this entire establishment into a stage for elaborate deception," Holmes murmured, his voice carrying that note of professional appreciation he reserved for particularly sophisticated criminal enterprises. The whispering acoustics, the moving figures, the psychological harassment of poor Thorne, these were not random acts of supernatural malice, but carefully orchestrated components designed to create the conditions necessary for profitable acquisition. Lestrade, who had been examining the speaking tube network with growing understanding, suddenly gestured for absolute silence. Through the brass conduits came the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the chambers above, accompanied by voices engaged in urgent, whispered consultation. Our adversaries had arrived for their final performance, unaware that their carefully orchestrated drama was about to encounter an audience they had not anticipated. Holmes consulted his pocket watch with grim precision. 9 o'clock exactly, Watson. They have chosen their timing with characteristic calculation, sufficient darkness to conceal their movements, yet early enough to establish alibis elsewhere when the conflagration begins. Through the speaking tube system, we could hear the conspirators' voices with startling clarity as they moved through the galleries above. Quarmby's cultured tones carried the authority of assumed proprietorship, while Pritchard's nervous interjections revealed the strain of a man operating beyond his natural criminal inclinations. Most chilling of all was Barlow's matter-of-fact discussion of technical details, as though the destruction of human life and artistic achievement were merely problems of mechanical engineering to be solved with professional competence. "The gas is sealed, but we have the spirit lamps," came Barlow's voice through the tubes. "The storax will carry the flame without need for the main supply. Pritchard, begin with the Napoleon. Its base contains the most valuable components." "And the girl?" Quarmby's voice held a cold calculation that chilled my blood. "An unfortunate victim of the supernatural forces that claimed her employer," Pritchard replied with academic detachment. "The insurance settlement will be all the more convincing for the completeness of the tragedy." Holmes's eyes blazed with that fierce intensity that marked his moments of greatest moral outrage. "Positions, gentlemen," he whispered with quiet authority. "They intend to transform this establishment into a funeral pyre for their own profit, but we shall ensure that justice, rather than avarice, emerges triumphant from tonight's performance." The basement chambers seemed to hold their breath as we prepared for the confrontation that would determine whether the elaborate conspiracy that had claimed Elias Thorne's life would achieve its ultimate objective. Above us, the footsteps continued their measured progress through the museum's galleries, each step bringing us closer to the moment when theatrical deception would finally encounter the harsh illumination of truth, and when the whispers in the wax museum would at last speak the language of justice rather than greed. Holmes positioned himself near the central valve system, his hand resting upon a lever that would flood the upper chambers with harmless but dramatic clouds of steam from the building's heating system. "When I give the signal, Watson," he murmured with that quiet confidence that had carried us through so many dangerous moments, "we shall provide our adversaries with a supernatural manifestation they did not anticipate, one in which the very forces they have exploited will serve to deliver them into the hands of justice." The moment Holmes had orchestrated arrived with theatrical precision as the conspirators' footsteps echoed through the galleries above, their whispered consultations carrying clearly through the speaking tube network they had installed for their own nefarious purposes. With the calm deliberation of a master conductor preparing his greatest symphony, Holmes positioned his hand upon the central steam valve and gave me a meaningful glance. "Now, Watson," he murmured with quiet authority, "we shall provide our adversaries with a supernatural manifestation worthy of their own elaborate deceptions." The effect was immediate and spectacular. Throughout the museum's upper chambers, jets of superheated steam began hissing from concealed vents with volcanic intensity, transforming the carefully arranged galleries into a phantasmagorical landscape of billowing vapor and dancing shadows. The conspirators' confident voices erupted in immediate confusion and alarm as their methodical preparations dissolved into chaos. "Pritchard, what have you done?" Quarmby's cultured tones carried a note of panic that spoke to the complete collapse of their careful planning. This was not part of the mechanism. Holmes moved with surprising agility to the central speaking tube junction, selecting the conduit that led directly to the Chamber of Horrors, where the Moriarty figure presided over their macabre stage. Placing his mouth to the brass trumpet, he projected his voice with that commanding authority that had dominated countless criminals, yet now altered to emerge with spectral resonance from the very lips of the wax professor. "The dead do not rest easy when their sanctuary is defiled by murderous greed." Holmes's words seemed to emanate from the painted features themselves. "Elias Thorne demands justice for the conspiracy that claimed his life." The psychological impact was profound and immediate. Through the tube system, we could hear Pritchard's sharp intake of breath, followed by his barely coherent muttering about impossible manifestations and supernatural retribution. Even Barlow's practical nature seemed shaken as Holmes activated the pulley mechanisms, causing the Napoleon figure to pivot ominously, while Lady Macbeth raised her hands in spectral accusation. "The figures are moving!" Pritchard's voice rose to near hysteria. "This is impossible. We control the mechanisms." "Control yourselves." Barlow's rougher tones carried a tremor that betrayed his own mounting unease. "Someone has discovered our apparatus." At this moment, Lestrade's constables began their coordinated advance through the steam-shrouded galleries, their movements perfectly concealed by the vaporous chaos Holmes had created. The acoustic confusion generated by the speaking tubes masked their approach until the final, decisive moment. "Surrender yourselves." Lestrade's authoritative voice cut through the supernatural theater with the harsh clarity of legal justice. "You are surrounded, and your conspiracy is fully exposed." The capture that followed demonstrated the complete effectiveness of Holmes's psychological warfare. Quarmby, attempting escape through what he believed to be a concealed exit, found himself trapped in a storage chamber where Holmes had anticipated his retreat. Pritchard, overcome by the very supernatural manifestations he had helped create, collapsed in terror before the Moriarty figure that had witnessed poor Thorne's final moments. Barlow proved more resourceful, disappearing into the steam with the swift movement of one intimately familiar with the building's hidden passages. Yet Holmes had anticipated even this eventuality, and the sound of his calm voice rose from the basement depths. "The coal drop is sealed, Mr. Barlow. There is no escape through the tunnels you helped construct." Within minutes, all three conspirators stood in custody, their elaborate theatrical preparations having served ultimately to facilitate their own downfall. As the steam began to dissipate and normal illumination returned to the galleries, Holmes stood amid the settling vapors with that expression of quiet satisfaction that marked the successful resolution of a particularly challenging case. "The insurance fraud is documented," he announced with methodical precision, producing the evidence we had gathered. "The property swindle is exposed through Mr. Swithin's cooperation. The mechanical deceptions that terrorized poor Thorne have been turned against their creators with perfect justice." Lestrade secured the prisoners with professional efficiency. Yet I observed that Holmes's expression suggested our investigation had revealed implications extending far beyond the immediate conspiracy. The methods employed represented a new sophistication in criminal enterprise, one that transformed murder into elaborate performance art designed to manipulate both victims and authorities. "We have captured the players, Watson," Holmes murmured as we prepared to leave the museum. "But the theatre itself may prove to have a more extensive company than we have yet discovered." The systematic interrogation that followed revealed the conspiracy's intricate architecture with methodical precision, each confession adding another layer to our understanding of the elaborate deception that had transformed a respectable museum into an instrument of murder. Holmes positioned himself before the assembled prisoners with that commanding presence that had dominated countless criminal examinations, his keen intellect now focused upon extracting the final details of their macabre collaboration. "The technical execution was masterful," Holmes began, his finger tracing the hidden seam in the Moriarty pedestal. "Mr. Thorne was lured to this precise position by voices projected through your speaking tube network and focused by the chamber's elliptical acoustics. Observe the chair's placement directly at the focal point, where sound would seem to emanate from the wax professor's painted lips." Pritchard, his nervous composure completely shattered, stammered his confession with trembling hands. The assessment was legitimate initially. Quarmby commissioned a proper survey for theatrical conversion. But when Thorne proved resistant to sale, the modifications became more sinister in purpose. Holmes crouched beside the pedestal, revealing the cunning mechanism that had claimed Thorne's life. The warmth we detected emanated from a concealed gas jet, positioned here behind the figure's cravat. In a sealed chamber, even a gentle flow of coal gas would induce vertigo, panic, and ultimately cardiac collapse in a man already overwrought by weeks of psychological harassment. "We never intended direct murder," Pritchard protested, his academic detachment crumbling under moral weight. "Yet you prepared the storax-laced wax mixture specifically to seal his features posthumously." Holmes continued with inexorable logic, producing a fine wire mechanism from within the pedestal. This spring-loaded applicator delivered the theatrical signature, the supernatural seal that would suggest otherworldly intervention while concealing human agency. Barlow's confession revealed the mechanical mastery behind their deceptions. Every figure could be manipulated from the basement control station through piano wire and counterweights. The Napoleon pivots on this axis. Lady Macbeth raises her hands through this pulley system. Combined with the acoustic network, we created a comprehensive illusion of supernatural animation. "And the locked chamber?" Lestrade inquired, his professional curiosity overcoming his moral outrage. Holmes demonstrated with practiced efficiency, engaging a concealed spring mechanism in the door jamb. A false rebate installed during Pritchard's assessment. A line drawn beneath the door could engage this catch and then be withdrawn, creating the perfect illusion of a room secured from within. Quarmby, maintaining his cultured composure despite complete exposure, provided the financial architecture. The Metropolitan Theatrical Syndicate was established specifically for this acquisition. The property's location and reputation made it ideal for conversion to a more profitable entertainment venue. The supernatural harassment was designed to drive Thorne to desperation, making him vulnerable to our option agreement. "Most ingenious," Holmes observed with professional appreciation. "Yet your elaborate preparations contained the very evidence that exposed your conspiracy. The speaking tubes that carried your whispered commands also conveyed your confessions to our ears. The mechanical systems that created supernatural terror became instruments of your own capture. As dawn penetrated London's fog, casting pale illumination through the museum's windows, Holmes stood among the wax figures that had served as silent witnesses to such calculated evil. The conspiracy had transformed legitimate business into elaborate murder, employing psychological manipulation to achieve financial objectives through methods of startling sophistication. "Inspector Lestrade," Holmes announced with quiet satisfaction, "we possess sufficient evidence to ensure justice matches the theatrical precision our adversaries employed in their criminal enterprise." Yet even as the prisoners were led away, I observed Holmes's thoughtful expression suggested implications extending beyond immediate resolution. The methods revealed, the transformation of murder into performance art, the systematic exploitation of human psychology, the careful orchestration of evidence to support fraudulent objectives, represented a new sophistication in criminal conspiracy that might prove merely the beginning of a larger, more troubling pattern. Miss Ashford, who had maintained her composure throughout the revelations, approached Holmes with evident gratitude. "You have saved more than property, Mr. Holmes. You have restored reason to a place given over to calculated madness." Holmes offered his slight bow with characteristic courtesy. "Madame, I have merely demonstrated that the most supernatural manifestations yield to methodical investigation when human agency lies beneath their apparent mystery." As we prepared to leave the museum, Holmes cast one final glance at the Chamber of Horrors, where poor Thorne's chair sat empty before the Moriarty figure. "The whispers in this establishment will speak no more of supernatural menace, Watson, but will serve as testimony to the triumph of justice over elaborate theatrical deception." The fog-shrouded streets of Bloomsbury awaited our return, yet I sensed our investigation had revealed criminal methods whose implications would extend far beyond this single, albeit extraordinary, case. The pale light of dawn filtering through the museum's windows seemed to banish the last vestiges of supernatural dread as Holmes stood among the silent wax figures, their painted faces now restored to mere artistic representation rather than instruments of terror. The elaborate conspiracy that had transformed legitimate business into theatrical murder lay exposed in all its calculated malevolence. Yet I sensed that Holmes's mind was already organizing the intricate details for presentation to those who would demand complete understanding. "The locked chamber presented our first puzzle," Holmes began, addressing our assembled group with that methodical precision that marked his greatest explanations. "Yet observe how human ingenuity created impossibility from simple mechanics." He demonstrated the concealed rebate mechanism Pritchard had installed, showing how a line drawn beneath the door could engage the catch and be withdrawn, creating perfect illusion of internal security. The supernatural manifestations followed scientific principles throughout. The pedestal's warmth emanated from a concealed gas jet positioned behind Moriarty's cravat, sufficient in a sealed chamber to induce vertigo and panic in a man already overwrought by weeks of psychological harassment. The storax-laced wax mixture, applied posthumously, provided their theatrical signature while masking the coal gas scent that might have revealed their method. Holmes moved to the mechanical apparatus we had discovered, his finger tracing the piano wire and pulley systems with evident appreciation for their technical sophistication. Every figure could be manipulated from the basement control station, creating comprehensive illusion of supernatural animation. Combined with the acoustic network that transformed whispered commands into ghostly voices, our adversaries had created a perfect storm of psychological manipulation. Miss Ashford, who had maintained remarkable composure throughout these revelations, stepped forward with quiet determination. "The museum will reopen within the fortnight, gentlemen. Several established collectors have offered assistance to honor Mr. Thorne's memory by maintaining his educational mission, though with considerably more conventional security measures." Holmes offered his slight bow with characteristic courtesy. "Admirable, Miss Ashford. Yet I trust the speaking tubes have been sealed and the mechanical systems dismantled. Completely, she replied with wan humor. Never again will whispers in empty chambers serve purposes other than natural acoustics. Lestrade's subsequent report revealed the conspiracy's staggering scope. Quarmby has confessed to 17 separate properties targeted for similar acquisition through what he terms atmospheric persuasion. The Metropolitan Theatrical Syndicate was established specifically for systematic fraud, employing supernatural theater as their primary tool of psychological manipulation. As we prepared to leave the museum, Holmes cast one final glance at the Chamber of Horrors, where poor Thorne's empty chair stood before the Moriarty figure that had witnessed such calculated evil. The whispers in this establishment will speak no more of supernatural menace, Watson, but will serve as testimony to human ingenuity perverted to criminal purpose. Our hansom cab carried us through London's clearing fog toward the familiar comfort of Baker Street, where Holmes settled into his accustomed chair with that expression of quiet satisfaction that marked successful resolution. "You will chronicle this case, Watson," he said, taking up his pipe with deliberate movements. "Make it clear that the most supernatural manifestations yield to methodical investigation when human agency lies beneath their apparent mystery." The morning papers would soon proclaim the exposure of what they termed the supernatural swindle. Yet I knew our investigation had revealed criminal methods whose implications extended far beyond immediate resolution. The transformation of psychological manipulation into systematic acquisition represented a new sophistication in criminal enterprise, one that exploited human psychology with scientific precision. A brisk step mounted our stairs, and Mrs. Hudson announced Mr. Barnaby Wren of the British Museum, bearing urgent need of counsel regarding certain mysterious disappearances from their manuscript collection. Holmes glanced from the visitor's card to me with that sudden brightening I had always loved to see, the spark that leaps when the mind scents fresh mystery. "The fog is lifting, Watson," he observed with evident satisfaction. "We shall see what new shapes it has hidden." Thus concluded the case of the Whispering Wax Museum, where theatrical deception had served murderous greed, yet where methodical investigation had ultimately triumphed over the most elaborate conspiracy. The whispers had been silenced forever, their human authors exposed, and justice restored to chambers that had known only calculated terror. In the end, it was not supernatural forces that claimed victory, but the eternal human capacity to distinguish truth from illusion, reality from performance, and justice from even the most cunningly orchestrated deception.